In 1986, Arthur Visseltier, in his paper on the history of the Yale System's early years, asked if the Yale System was in fact a figment of the imagination. In the Yale School of Medicine bulletin that year, he noted there was no mention of the Yale System. After all, it's a system marked by absences, the absence of usual things in schools, required readings, attendance requirements, exams. Is this really a system? In 1986, I was a student of Arthur Visseltier's, and I remember a system, and I remember the Yale System, as a place where I chose what I would read, where I wasn't required to attend classes, but I went because I wanted to, because of my professors and my classmates, where I was one of the few students who took optional exams under the pseudonyms of different Star Trek characters. I also took history classes, hung out with French deconstructionists on campus, did a master's in English with an emphasis on ethnic literature and medical history. And in the process of researching the history of the Yale System for this talk today, I realized that my medical school experience was not so much an accident, but occurred in many different ways for so many students, and that this was somehow intended and enabled by the creators of the Yale System. Today we'll hear from 4 of our fellow alumni who will also confirm for them that the Yale System was real. Nobel Prize laureate Brian Kobilka, who because of the lack of course requirements, took advanced basic science and genetics courses. His lab has elucidated the structure and genetics of the adrenaline receptor, which is used by half of drugs today. Lee Goldman, Dean of the Columbia School of Medicine, who as a Yale medical student passed his national boards a year early, and then did a public health curriculum his own way. And out of this came the Goldman Index and the Goldman Criteria, which have changed cardiology and medical care today. Alexis Boer Kimball, president of Harvard Faculty Physicians at Beth Israel Deaconess, Harvard, who instead of taking the usual communications courses, worked at the CBS Evening News and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And because the Yale System accommodated the interests of its students, including her, she learned that she could do more effective research if the questions were based upon her own interests. Jerry Zeldis, the former chief medical officer of Celgene, who led the development of Propulsid, thalidomide, so many groundbreaking medical therapies. The world is a different place today because of graduates of the Yale School of Medicine and because of the Yale System. We'll hear from our speakers about how the Yale System changed their careers and their lives. But first, a history of the Yale System in its early years and the spirit in which it was founded. Don't have to put this here because the actual people are here. So, founded in 1810, the Yale School of Medicine was already 110 years old when Milton Charles Winternitz became its dean. He was the School of Medicine's first Jewish full professor and first Jewish dean, at a time when, because of his ethnicity, he was barred from purchasing a home in the Prospect Street neighborhood and was initially barred from membership at the Graduate Club. But that didn't stop Winternitz, who Yale President James Angell called a steam engine in pants. In the 1920s, there was not much happening on Cedar Street. It was during Winternitz's years as dean when the Yale School of Medicine acquired much of what we associate with it today, including the building we are in right now and the Yale System of Medical Education. In 1920, the year Winternitz became dean, he sent the General Education Board a plea for funds. You'll see the SOS here. Winternitz envisioned a campus where the School of Medicine would be linked to many other schools, the School of Law, the Divinity School, the Institute of Human Behavior. This is one of many drawings and versions of Winternitz's plan that the School of Medicine should have close collaborations with other schools. And indeed, one of Winternitz's first actions was to assure that School of Medicine faculty became Yale University faculty. He also wanted medical study to be more like graduate study rather than trade school, and for medical students to be research-oriented, more like graduate students. The schools of law and divinity were built elsewhere, not on Cedar Street, but the Sterling Hall of Medicine was indeed built here, along with the Institute of Human Relations. Although the Institute no longer exists, the building survived. We are in it right now. And I would argue that the spirit of the Institute lives on in the Yale system. Winter's pleas for funds were approved. By 1921, the Yale Alumni Weekly announced that the Sterling Hall of Medicine would be built. Winternitz was a man who got things done, and the Sterling Hall of Medicine was dedicated in 1925. You'll recognize that this is not the building that we know as the School of Medicine. This building on Davenport Street no longer exists. And the building which we identify as the School of Medicine was initially conceived as linked with the Institute of Human Relations. So in the year 1920, applicants to the School of Medicine were dwindling, and only 68 people applied. The faculty were kind of upset and wanted this to change. William Welch, who was Winternitz's mentor, stated that despite 100 years of existence, Yale contributed nothing to medicine. Education in the 1920s, according to Donald Moore, class of 1981, the dominant schools of thought were averagism and Taylorism. It was the age of the Industrial Revolution, the age of industrialization. Sameness among students was actually the goal, just like sameness among products. Education was aimed at producing good factory workers. This was not all of education, but these were dominant thoughts. So the Yale system was a kind of radical departure from lots of other education going on at the time. According to Dean Vernon Lippard, schools taught medicine by grammar school standards, recitations, memorizations, lab experiments with the goal of a neat report. The Yale Plan, as it was called then, was one where Winternitz envisioned that medical students are mature individuals, strongly motivated to learn, requiring guidance and stimulation rather than compulsion or competition. And one of the goals was, how do you instill the passion for learning and the habits of lifelong learning into medical students who will be here for just a few years, but who need to learn for the rest of their lives? So in trying to figure out when the Yale system started, although it was instituted in 1926, I think it was first conceived in 1920. And according to Priscilla Waters Norton and Howard Spiro, the Yale Plan had its beginnings in Winter's first year as dean. Okay. So the educational changes came gradually over the next, I'd say, 10 years or so, but immediately he reversed the order of third and fourth year experiences and thought it was important for students to spend their third year in the hospital, whereas before it was the fourth year. And by 1922, the time for the thesis was increased to 3 years. A thesis was always required. It was a long-standing tradition in the Yale School of Medicine, actually, but it was kind of codified during these years. By the mid-20s, they considered abolishing classes and for the student to be able to select the sequence of classes. Here's the curriculum from the first year of the Yale system. And according to Arthur Visseltier, by 1926, the essential components of the Yale system were in place. Now what were they? And I think it'll be clear from this history that the Yale system has changed over time. So according to Raymond Hussey, who was the curriculum committee chair,
The Yale System was inaugurated in 1926, and the essential elements were elimination of the class system, which, quote, encouraged rigidity in plan of study, greater freedom in arranging the sequence of subjects for the students, greater responsibility upon the student for his education. There were a couple of women in this class, actually. The elimination of exams, which many of the faculty members wrote, discourages the proper type of study. They also said things like exams confuse the student as in terms of the means or the ends. However, they thought there needed to be some method of assessment, and so they created a comprehensive exam that was given at the end of 2 years, and this was first given in 1927. Harold Burr, in 1929, so within a few years they decided to evaluate the Yale system, and the committee was headed by Harold Burr, an electoral neurologist. And the committee found that the faculty spent more time with students. Quote, the release from routine quizzes, grades, and exams has removed an element of fear from those relationships to the benefit of both teacher and students. And interestingly, they found that good students seemed to profit considerably, whereas the poor students seemed to suffer. The Institute of Human Relations was founded in 1929, and it was something Winternitz, it was kind of his pet project, his pride and joy. And he founded it to emphasize the unity of human knowledge. The Institute incorporated the fields of psychology, sociology, anthropology, psychiatry. Winternitz saw medicine as a socially significant science, and he also saw the Institute of Human Relations as the center of the Cedar Street campus. According to Arthur Visseltier years later, the Yale plan was to be an extension of the principles underlying the Institute of Human Relations, in the same way that the Institute of Human Relations found expression in the Yale plan. Each unified, resonated, and reinforced the other. So I really believe that even though this institute no longer exists, it lives on in the Yale system. Here it is. See the dome being built. The Institute of Human Relations was dedicated in 1931. And Winternitz said what he envisioned was that universities should be interested primarily in providing opportunity for learning. He thought that universities should be a great machine for teaching, and that a university should protect learning from the inroads of teaching and methodology of all sorts. So it's kind of like build the machine and put the students in it. And as my own professor, Seth Pausner, has called it, shake and bake. Just put the ingredients together and just let them do their thing. Okay. Interestingly, he thought that vacation periods often yielded the greatest harvest for the training period. And in that spirit, he asked for all departments to remain open year-round, including vacations. And he said that freedom from even a relatively small amount of required work permits the use of interest and intelligence in a way that is well-nigh impossible at other periods. And for myself, even after I graduated, I came back during vacations to hang out on the psychiatry consultation liaison service with Robert Bick and Seth Pausner, and with my thesis advisor, David Musto. And this happened during vacation periods. Okay. Winternitz, upon his retirement in 1950, looked back on the Yale system and said that the attitude of students toward the school after graduation has become more and more one of interest and loyalty. Okay, so the Institute of Human Relations dissolved in the 1930s, but Abraham Flexner told Winternitz and consoled him the Institute of Human Relations was in actuality Yale University. Indeed, the law school, the Vinnie School, got built over there. And during Winternitz's time as dean between 1920 and 1935, applications increased from 68 to over 500 applicants to the School of Medicine. Stanhope Bain Jones became the dean in 1935, And he noted that Yale produced resourceful, practical students and a cultivation of the intellectual capacity to distinguish means from ends. I found this man, who was chair of the Department of Surgery at that time, one of the more entertaining writers about the Yale system. And of traditional education, he noted that the student puts his tuition in the slot, jumps in the hopper, and comes out the link of a sausage. He also said about class attendance, it is no function of the faculty to provide the student with transportation. Tuition is not car fare. And the student should not be disillusioned that by deposit of a fee, tuition, he can transfer the weight of the burden of education to the faculty. Dr. Clark noted 5 essential qualities for a physician, and he said that none of these can be best taught by traditional didactic and obligatory methods, and that they must be learned from experience. 2 of them, he thought, could not even be taught: intelligence and integrity. He said that any hope that low intellectual capacity can be increased by education should be abandoned, and that he thought that schools should screen for integrity in admitting students, and that those who seemed dishonest or whose primary interest in medicine was for social or financial advancement should be excluded. But he thought that education could change things: the capacity for work, judgment, horse sense, as he called it, and skill in the use of the scientific method. And they thought that the scientific method is used day to day in clinical medicine, not just in science. Okay. So just a brief history of a few elements of the Yale system regarding exams. Comprehensive exams were instituted in 1926-27, replaced by the national boards in 1931. And then the national boards were eliminated in 1937 by Dean Baines Jones, who was actually a consultant to the national boards. Too many Yale students were passing it. The pass rate was over 99%, and so they thought it wasn't assessing much. And in 1940, a committee realized that quizzes and exams were still being held on a regular basis and that they must be reduced. In 1942, the national boards were reinstated, and in 1980s, when I was a student here, qualifying exams for each basic science course were instituted. The thesis was a tradition prior to the Yale system, but even that has changed. In 1942, when 89 Yale Medical School faculty left for military service, the thesis was eliminated. And Yale actually went into an accelerated 3-year medical program. The thesis was reinstated in 1944. So what is the Yale system? So I spoke to Dean Belitsky yesterday, and according to our conversation, the defining characteristics are flexibility, respect for the autonomy of students, mentorship, thesis, and attempts to reduce competitiveness and to work collaboratively. Nancy Engoff, Associate Dean for Student Affairs, calls the Yale system a vibrant, continually changing system. We educate and inspire scholars and future leaders. We value our enormous diversity. I think the current class includes 4 DACA students. I asked Seth Pausner, who continues to be my mentor, even though I've long, left being a student of his. And in the process, I realized that he is not just an intellectual, but a physical product of the Yale system. His parents met here and were graduates of the class of 1953. I couldn't resist putting his baby picture here. And according to my former professor, Seth, who I still go to for advice, 100 years of the Yale system, ask not what it is, but what you made of it. And with that, I'd like to turn to our distinguished panel of speakers. And I thought that just going in alphabetical order, as in the program, would be a good idea. So, Lee Goldman.
First, I want to thank Dean Alpern for taking such great care of our medical school. Want to acknowledge two of my classmates, Harold Mancusi-Ungaro and George Lister, for their honors, and thank Bob Gifford, who was my mentor here years ago and doesn't look any different today than he did then. I'm going to tell a story with three parts. One is how I gerrymandered the curriculum. The second is how I surprisingly got hooked on research. And the third would be how we've changed the curriculum at Columbia to mimic in many ways what I thought were the great assets of the curriculum here at Yale. So my story starts as a history major coming to medical school, and it really begins sort of in desperation. We start off with anatomy, where the smell of formaldehyde makes me sick, histology, where they turn off the lights so I fall asleep, and embryology, where everything's in 3 dimensions, which I can't follow. So after about a week, I'm totally lost and wondering whether I really should have gone to law school. To make things worse, we have classes like all day long, from I think 8 to 5, except for 2 hours on Thursdays when we play touch football or whatever. And I say, this can't continue. I got to figure out some better way. And somehow I looked at the course catalog and saw that there's a course that I might be able to talk my way into at the School of Public Health during those 2 free hours from 3 to 5 on Thursdays. So I talked my way into it, and it was taught in English. The light stayed on. There was no formaldehyde. Nothing moved in 3 dimensions, and so I could actually follow it. And I said, this has some promise. And within a couple of weeks, I decided a couple of trajectories. One, I might be able to gerrymander the curriculum to get 2 degrees in 4 years. I really couldn't afford to spend 5. I was a scholarship student, and it would just mean, taking more debt. To do that, I needed to figure out a way to pass the boards, take a full load of public health classes, and write 1 thesis for both degrees. It became pretty clear the only way to do that was to take the public health classes the first semester of 2nd year. This was during the brief period of time when the curriculum here was like it is now, like, a year and a half of basic science, followed by the clinical year, followed by electives. To do that, I had to figure out a way to pass the boards early, and as a history major, I was not at all prepared to do that. So I had to figure out a way to basically go on an independent study course. So I mostly stopped going to class. If I went to class, I sat in the back left row, and I brought a book with me to read in case the lecture wasn't as good as I hoped it would be. Bought the smallest book for every course, and read on my own. Took the boards in September at the beginning of 2nd year, and much to the chagrin of the faculty, I passed. Even more to the chagrin of the faculty, my highest score on the boards was on pharmacology, which we hadn't had yet. So I now could sign up for a full load of public health classes, which turned out to be less interesting than the medical school classes. So I took up golf.
Okay.
And got my score down from 110 to 81. Read a medicine textbook to be prepared for clerkship starting in January. And then had to figure out how to do a thesis, because I'd come here because there were no exams and no grades, and despite the fact that there was a thesis. But through the School of Public Health, got interested in computer programming, multivariate analysis, and ended up doing a thesis that surveyed Yale medical students and graduates' attitudes toward national health insurance, because this was the Nixon era when we almost had national health insurance under Nixon and Kennedy, who couldn't agree on whether there should be deductibles or HMOs, and it probably would have happened if Watergate hadn't happened. Sounds familiar in some ways, isn't it? I learned how to program, learned how to do multivariable analysis, and that became the really starting off point for what I did subsequently in terms of medical research. I loved the research, I got totally hooked on it, and what started off as being that despite the thesis became really for me a lifelong change in my career and my career aspirations. So the whole thing worked extraordinarily well for me. When I became Dean at Columbia 11 years ago, I came to a medical school that I did not apply to because back at that time it had no electives and lots of exams. And I got there, and of course the Columbia curriculum really hadn't changed at all. And the first thing that we did was to start the process to go from 2 years of pre-clerkship to a year and a half. I tried to eliminate exams, but the Columbia ethos wouldn't permit that. We did go to pass-fail for the first year and a half. I argued strongly for pass-pass, but was outvoted. And like the curriculum here at Yale, we put into place a required scholarly project. We were finding, and I think the same thing maybe was true here at Yale, that a majority of our students were staying for a 5th year because they thought that was the only way to do the research they thought they needed to do to get an internship. And by putting that time into the 4 years, we've now reduced the number of students who stay for a 5th year down to about 30%. That's not, of course, not including the MD-PhD students. So students can still stay if they want to. So basically what I did as dean was to take what I thought were some of the strongest parts of the Yale curriculum and to migrate them to New York. Unable, as I said, to do away with exams, although they are now not graded, and as I said, pass-fail. So I'm just really thankful to be back here, grateful for my Yale education, and it was 4 years that truly changed my life. I came out so different than I thought I would be. I really expected to be an orthopedist. That was before I realized I had no three-dimensional sense. I thought I'd be a practicing physician, which I did for a number of years, but I never thought I'd be a researcher, and that really is what transformed my life and my career. So I'm very grateful to Yale and always will be.
Alexa.
So thanks so much, and I too would just want to echo the sentiment of how fun it is to be back and how fun it has been to actually reflect on how these formative experiences have affected my career and the way I think about physicians and healthcare delivery in general. So I too, I remember sitting in college. I was a molecular biology and public policy major, which people again thought was a little odd, but I'd always had this sort of track of doing things just a click off the norm, not too far, but just a little bit different. And I went into the pre-med advising office and I looked on the bookshelves and there were all the catalogs, and I remember reading the Yale one, and it said, topics for recent thesis proposals have been the role of plagues in theater. And I went, I'm in. So I chose Yale not because I knew about the system. It actually wasn't really in the book. I chose it because of the outcomes. I wanted a place that was going to give me the flexibility to think about not just my skills as a practitioner, but also how I would be having impact in a broader setting. So I interviewed here, I learned about the Yale system, and I went, even better, no grades, no exams, sign me up. Applied only here, got in, and that was the end of that story. So what did I do once I got here? Well, a couple things. I volunteered in the community teaching high school students in New Haven about HIV. I was chaired the Committee on the Well-Being of Students, which actually turned out to be incredibly important for some of the work I do now for how do we keep physicians well in the current research climate. I went and worked in Winslow, Arizona for a month at the Indian Health Service. But most importantly, and perhaps the most radical, as you heard about, is I did a lot of training in communication. I did a AAAS fellowship in Atlanta, doing medical writing for a summer, wrote 43 articles in the paper, and then off to CBS Evening News, where I interned with Bob Arnott and on the Connie Chung program, and wrote scripts for TV nationally about different things that were happening in medicine. And that was an incredible experience because the team of producers were extraordinarily good. Bob wasn't always around all that much, and so having a medical student who knew what thrombocytopenia actually was incredibly helpful to them, and really led to just an incredible experience. So I had a wonderful time, and my thesis was also, again, a click off the usual. I wrote on the images of cocaine in the media in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and how that affected prison sentencing, which ultimately actually made it into JAMA, sort of unexpectedly, but you never know how these sort of, again, unusual things will happen. But what did I get out of that? I learned that my instincts of what was going to be interesting, helpful, and important to me were really valid, and that I could develop a curriculum and an experience that was going to help me attain my goals and the things that I thought I was best prepared to do. So I went off to residency in dermatology, had a wonderful experience, and then I went to NIH. I had spent a month elective there, and they actually tried to recruit me into their laboratory program there. And I had this moment of, oh my gosh, it's NIH, I'm so flattered, this is amazing. And then I thought, I'm really not good at lab. I'll be really mediocre if I go to the lab. So I went back to them and I said, hey, I have a better idea for me, see if it works for you, which is let's create a clinical trials fellowship for me. And we did that, and it has been actually much more successful than some of the basic science fellowships that have been there, and was incredibly formative and helped me to figure out what ultimately my career path became. And I wouldn't have had the insight that I could actually ask that question. I could think about what I wanted to be and how I wanted to get there, and how could I design the system and the support to be there. Parenthetically, around that time, I took my master's in public health course at Johns Hopkins, which I had not selected for medical school because I had heard all they did was memorize and take tests. So I go, public health school might be a little different, I figure, and I get there, and it is no different at all. So it was so hard to place out of courses. I'd taken epi, I was pretty good at some of the quantitative stuff. It was so much effort to try to get a test arranged to place out of the courses, I finally just gave up, got a straight 4.0 average. And then at the end, it turned out I hadn't taken the introductory 2-week course. Now, the introductory course was supposed to be about the basic tenets and principles you were going to apply during the rest of the 2 years, which clearly I had mastered, right? And they actually made me come back and take it. I just thought,
Wow.
no real harm, no real foul, but I could have used those 2 weeks to actually help some patients at that point in the game. I could have written a paper. I could have done other things with that time. But the rigidity of saying, being unable to recognize I had clearly mastered those concepts and could do something more interesting, I would have taken anything at that point, something fascinating, and they didn't give me that opportunity. So it really did make me reflect on how Yale had given me all of that freedom to explore in a lot of different areas. I will also say parenthetically, the communications training did lead to me actually having a cable access TV show for several years. It was sort of the Wayne's World of medical TV. If you were in Palo Alto in sort of the early 2000s, it was on Channel 4, so a lot of people have actually seen it. And still, people come up to me just randomly and say, I used to watch you on TV. So that hasn't really gotten into my day job, but the skills on how to communicate, how to synthesize, how to think about how we bring to bear and engage both physicians, our patients, and really the whole community of citizens of the United States who need to be engaged in both their individual health and how we are going to manage these major public health issues from both funding and provision of care is critical. So I'll just end with sort of some other, I think, key reflections. Sometimes things that start out and seem a little anachronistic actually prepare you better for the future than you would ever expect. When you think about what learning is about now, we are not about memorization. Those days of carrying that 3x5 card in my pocket and that little booklet of antibiotics, I can get all that off my phone or off a computer terminal or all that information that we used to memorize is at our fingertips. What we need to teach people to do is analyze, synthesize, evaluate, and start to bring information together. The days of memorizing rickettsial diseases for the 10th time are probably not adding that same value anymore with the information we have. And I'd also argue we know a lot more about education, too. I see, even in the elementary schools now, they talk to the kids about, are you an auditory learner? Are you a visual learner? I'm a kinesthetic learner. I need to be moving around in order to understand and synthesize what I'm doing. We need to give people the opportunity to both have that insight, but then figure out what is the best way they learn. Yale, clearly, to thrive at Yale, you need a certain type, right? We have to be careful about the students we select who are going to do well in that. I think there is some structure we can provide and insight on how they might get the most out of it, but then we should let them go. I would say my one regret from my days at Yale is I did not ski quite enough. I did learn to windsurf, though, so that was also really fun. But I think this is a really different time, and I think instilling that commitment to lifelong learning, to exploration, to asking questions, and to demanding some self-insight on how you want to get there is really the intrinsic value of what this has to offer. And I couldn't be more grateful for how it shaped my experience.
Why don't we go next to Brian Kobylka, in keeping with the program.
Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I have to say I really think that being able to learn at Yale, to come to Yale, had a huge impact on my career. Although when I first came to Yale, I was really quite stressed. I had no idea what the Yale system was. I grew up in a small town in Minnesota, went to a relatively small liberal arts branch of the University of Minnesota, and spent almost all of my time as an undergraduate working very hard to get the best grades I could so that I could get into medical school. And I believed I wanted to be a physician based on just my experience as a kid growing up in a small town. The physicians were really highly respected, and I particularly admired my pediatrician. So I'm not sure that I ever had the right motives, but I went to the University of Minnesota. I majored in biology and chemistry, worked incredibly hard. Surprisingly, and not surprisingly, although I applied to 10 medical schools, I only got into 2, I think largely because all I did was study. And the 2 were really quite different. One was the University of Minnesota branch in Duluth, which was training family practitioners, and the other was Yale. And I really don't have any idea how I got into Yale. And when I arrived at Yale, I found out there were no exams, and I was so used to learning for the exam that I spent the first, I would say, half year studying constantly. I figured the only way for me to be sure that I was learning everything was simply to every waking moment study. And eventually, through intervention by my classmates and ultimately my wife, I began to relax a bit. I still probably studied more than most students, but I began to really enjoy the experience of going to classes that were, I could sit in on graduate school classes. Many of the graduate students took classes with us, and I really just began to enjoy the process of learning and to understand that I wasn't going to learn everything, I couldn't memorize everything, but I could get a really good foundation, and I could figure out most things from having that very strong foundation. So I think that was really transformative for me. The other is the research experience, to search for projects that I was interested in. My first was a public health project where I took advantage of the travel opportunity. My first year I went to Malaysia, and my goal was to try to develop an assay where we could look for the prevalence of dengue in mosquitoes. So I spent quite a bit of time in a hot, damp room in Malaysia full of mosquitoes, and trying to use immunologic techniques to find whether they were infected or not. Unfortunately, that really didn't work out, but it was a really great experience working in what was then really a third world research lab. I ultimately had a project, again in public health, in virology, where I characterized the genetic diversity of rotavirus, which is a common cause of diarrhea in children. And I think what both of those projects taught me was the rudiments of research, but they taught me that I really wanted a research project that I could do full time and really decide whether I wanted to do research or not. It gave me the interest in learning whether this was a career approach for me. However, I was on a public health service corps scholarship, and I really didn't have an opportunity at the time I was graduating to do more research. I had to either choose a medicine program, pediatrics, or OBGYN. So I chose medicine. I went to Barnes in St. Louis, and after, I think, 2 years, the Reagan administration pretty much defunded the public health service. So I no longer had to pay back by working in a inner city hospital or an Indian reservation, and I could do an academic payback. So this was a really fantastic opportunity for me. And because of my interest in intensive care medicine, I chose to go to Duke to do a cardiology fellowship. And at Duke, one of the advantages at Duke was they also included a significant research component, and you could start doing research as opposed to your clinical training. So I chose probably one of the biggest labs at Duke, and it was focused on receptors for adrenaline. And since I was interested in intensive care medicine and I was giving patients both beta agonists and beta blockers, I thought this was something I should learn about. And I ended up in this lab with at least 30 people. I never was able to really fully count the whole group. They were mostly postdocs. We had a few graduate students, and I was at the bottom of the, of the experienced people there. I knew almost nothing. And it again was where my experience at Yale, I didn't panic. I knew that I was capable of learning things on my own. And ultimately, I learned molecular biology. Upon moving to Stanford, I learned biochemistry, pharmacology, NMR spectroscopy, crystallography. Anything that I needed to address my questions, I knew that I could learn. I gained that confidence by coming here. More recently, I've been really interested in curriculum development at Stanford, and have tried to steer our curriculum into more flexible curriculum with the help of many of my colleagues, so that it can become more like it used to be and more like the Yale system was like when I was here. So again, I'm really grateful for having the opportunity to learn how to learn at Yale.
I say last but not least. We are really celebrating the good fortune of having gone to Yale and being allowed to have what I call lateral thinking. We didn't have to be regimented. We had to go to this course, take that exam, learn that bit of knowledge that some professor thought is the most important thing in the world. Instead, we had the freedom, at least I had the freedom, during neuroanatomy to learn how to drive a stick-shift car, because that was more important to me than looking at a chopped-up sheep's brain that looked like cauliflower to me. Or to sit in the back of this room when a fellow who, at this point I'd be very interested in what he had to say, but back then I wasn't. I fell asleep and I woke up and nudged the fellow next to me, Jack Tauber, and said, I wish this guy would shut up so I could continue to sleep. And he said, I wish you'd shut up so I can continue sleeping. And we were not punished for that. We were not demoted for that. I've had the good fortune to become somewhat of an elder statesman, believe it or not, in pharmaceutical development. And as a result, I've been asked to join a number of boards. And I recently got a solicitation from one of the top recruiting companies where they listed what was going on with the company and the traits they want of someone who is a director. And two things stood out to me that I thought I'd just share with you, then cycle back to my own story. The first bullet point is be an active listening, continuous learning, and flexible thinking as the basis of understanding and deciding. And the second bullet point is intellectual agility with an ability to bridge matters of science and business. Essentially, that is the product that I think we want all our students to achieve, to have that perspective that you go from data to knowledge to understanding to wisdom. And wisdom is nothing more than knowledge gained from experience. So my story. I'll waste a little time. I was very fortunate to go to Brown University. As it was transitioning from an old, rigid, traditional curriculum, and those who went to Yale, I apologize because you're still there, to a more innovative, where students would make up their own curriculum and get their own degree. I was the first person to graduate with an undergraduate degree in molecular biology at Brown. You could elect to take any course you wanted with a grade or a satisfactory. And I did have the pleasure of some professor who was lording over me to say, well, unless you do blah, 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 I'm going to give you a B. And I said, fine. Well, I elected a satisfactory, and I just got up and walked out of the store. There were two people who were quite influential in the way I developed. I always wanted to be a lawyer. And as an undergraduate, I ran into William Rehnquist when he was Solicitor General. And when he explained to me his philosophy of the law, I then thought of the most influential person in my life, which was my older brother. And he helped me both as an undergraduate and making the decision to go to Yale. As we were driving up to Providence, he said, I want to give you one bit of advice. Transcends the prosaic. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, if you don't know what to say on an exam, just write, this topic transcends the prosaic, and you'll get an A. I got a number of A's, thanks to Steve. As I thought I'd be going to law school, I was looking at folks at Brown who were going to some of the best law schools in the country, Yale, I think there's one at Harvard. And I really didn't respect them that much. On the other hand, my brother was in sync with me. We're 4 years apart, and he was at Yale Medical School. And that's where I first became acquainted with what the curriculum was like. Holy mackerel. It's a Wednesday night, and Steve went out to the movies with a bunch of his friends. How can you do that? And I went visiting him, and I saw the quality of the students that were his colleagues. And I said, I'd rather hang out with people like that than people back at Brown who are going to the law school. So I said, fine, I'm going to go to medical school. And I applied, and I got into 3 medical schools, and I was kind of hovering at Yale. Yale didn't know what to do. I applied for the M.D.PhD program. I got into the PhD part, no problem, but Yale was not so sure about me. And finally, I called up Jerry Burroughs, and I said, look, I'm going to Harvard unless you tell me today whether I'm going to Yale or not. And he said, do you promise to go to Yale? And I said, yes. And you can say someone turned down Harvard to go to Yale. An hour later, he called me back, and I got into Yale. And it was absolutely wonderful because I didn't have to reiterate information so I could satisfy some professor. I was able to read much more. I was able to read more advanced books. I went into my internship with a real inferiority problem because I felt that they had been examined on what they needed to do to be an intern. They had better knowledge. But what I discovered was that my fund of knowledge was much greater because I had more time to read. And when I was exhausted, yes, I would go to a movie or I'd do something. And then I'd refresh my brain and then go on. The point is that the 4 or 5 years you spend here is just another segment in one's development. And what I think we all want to be and we want to train are people who are grounded, who at the moment understand what they think they need and know how to get it or how to try to get it. And that's what the Yale system allowed me to do, and I think many of my colleagues. When I look at my class, it's extraordinary the number of people who have become true leaders in American medicine and in other areas of our society. And I think this, yes, it could happen at other medical schools. No question about it. You have to have fire in your belly. But I think this curriculum allowed people with fire in their belly to come here and try to develop and do things which other places would probably stifle. So I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. So I'll turn to Richard and to remind me of the schedule. What's that? 11:11. So break at 11:15, then 11:30 we'll come back? Okay. So at 11:30, please return for a conversation and also to ask questions and perhaps share your own story. And then in the afternoon between 2:15 and 4:15, we have a videographer, filmmaker, Robert Wynn here, and a team of students who will record people's personal narratives of the Yale system. So we invite you to come 2:15 to 4:15 to record your history for the archives and your experience with the Yale system. Okay, so we'll break for 15 minutes and reconvene at 11:30 for a conversation.
Not that often, 4 minutes long.